Hello, my name is Neil Munro and I've been working as a conference interpreter in the European institutions for, well, I was going to say for many years, actually it's for many decades. And you find me here sitting in one of the booths in one of the new conference rooms at the European institutions. So in a way I'm at the interpreter-delegate interface. And that's actually quite suitable, because what I'd like to share some thoughts with you about today is the way in which we use the role of the pure customer in order to assess interpretation. Now, as I say, I started work here a long time ago, but in those days the relationship between interpreters and delegates was actually very straightforward. If a delegate didn't understand the language, then he listened to the interpretation. Whereas if he did understand the language, he didn't. Well, that was the general rule. I had a very good friend in the Commission Secretariat who understood excellent French and German, but he said he always used to listen to the interpretation because he had to take detailed notes, and so that made the whole process a little bit easier for him. But as I say, otherwise it was very simple. But in the meantime, with the passage of so many years, we've seen the advent of a new type of delegate. In other words, a delegate who understands the original, but still listens to the interpretation. And sometimes that may just be idle curiosity, but as often as not, this is because the delegate is actually checking up on the interpretation to see if we're doing it all properly. Now, it's not something I particularly want to dwell on at the moment, but what I would like to say is that while we've seen that trend amongst delegates, amongst interpreters when testing people, when assessing performance and so on, we've actually moved, interestingly enough I think, in the totally different direction, because we're now using pure customers in order to assess the quality of an interpretation. And let me try and explain that to you. And I'll do that here in the comfort of a booth, because I guess that's where I tend to feel more at home. Now, when I started, I was very young indeed. In fact, I remember there was one colleague who said I was so wet behind the ears that they would wear Wellington boots when they shared a booth with me. But when I did all of my tests, and I started with French and German into English, there was a standard time-honoured procedure in the way in which my performance was judged. And that is, another colleague from the English booth with French and German would take consecutive notes from the same speech and then listen to me, or would listen with one ear to a simultaneous speech and with the other ear would listen to what I was saying in my interpretation. And it had always been done like that, and no one had ever really seen fit to question it. But with the wisdom of hindsight, it did actually ignore one very important feature. And that is, as anyone knows who's tried to do this, it is actually incredibly hard to assess how good, in particular, a simultaneous interpretation is when you're listening to the original at the same time. Again, I'll quote that with my own language combination. Of course, I can listen to a French speech and listen at the same time to a colleague working into English, and I can tell if they're generally following, I can tell if they're getting the main arguments, but the one thing I can't really do is stand back and say, how does this actually sound? Because it may well be that someone's following the structure so closely that they're actually giving pretty much a verbatim version of the original speech. And so they're sounding not like an English language interpreter, they're sounding like a French delegate speaking English. And with other language combinations, I think the risks are even greater. Take German into English. Now, I think everyone who doesn't have German is well aware of the pitfalls that German involves, the nicht coming up at the end of the sentence, the incredibly complicated syntax. And there are all sorts of different ways in which people will deal with that. One person might prefer to try and second guess where the delegate's going. Another person could give an equally good interpretation by using the infamous salami tactics and dividing it up into nice little bite-sized chunks. But say I'm a second guesser and I'm listening to someone who's interpreting who's more of a salami man, then it's virtually impossible for me to say how well they're doing, how accurate they are, and again, I repeat, how good it sounds when you're listening to it in English. And even with consecutive, the same situation arises, albeit to a lesser extent. If I've taken consecutive notes, then that will inevitably colour the way in which I react to someone who is doing a consecutive from the same speech. And it can work one way or the other. It may be that because I've understood something perfectly in a consecutive speech, even though the interpretation is a bit vague and woolly, I understand it because I've already heard the speech before. Or, as I say, it can work the other way. It may be that we have someone who's doing an interpretation in a different way from which I would choose, in a way which is more intuitive, more instinctive, and covering all the same ground, but because it's not what I would have said, I tend to feel uncomfortable with it. All of which, a number of years ago now, led to the advent of the pure customer. And it's really quite simple. Again, I'll illustrate it, French into English. On our test panels, selection boards, pretty much everyone with an English A also has a French C. But what we do is we make sure at least one member of the selection board doesn't listen to the original speech. So if it's a consecutive speech, they'll go out of the room. If it's a simultaneous speech, they'll clamp their headphones carefully over both ears and just listen to the interpretation. And ideally, when the panel starts to discuss, you would probably ask the pure customer, first of all, what their impression was. Did it sound plausible? Was it easy to follow? Was it logical? Did it all make sense? And obviously, if it hasn't sounded plausible, particularly if it hasn't made sense, then that doesn't bode well for the quality of the interpretation which is being judged. Now, of course, that's not the end of the story. You can't just ask the pure customer. I remember at one test hearing what I thought was the most brilliant retour into English I had ever heard. And I was so euphoric, I said to the panel, I think this is very good, because that's the way in which Brits express euphoria. But it turned out that the speech had been largely invented and was on the right subject, but otherwise was the candidate's speech to an enormous extent. In fact, it was the sort of interpretation where a disclaimer would have been in place. You know, something along the lines of all similarities between this interpretation and the original are purely accidental. But it can also work the other way. It may be that as a pure customer, I think a speech and interpretation I've heard is lacking in logic, or there's been some kind of non sequitur, or I can't quite see how the interpreter has got from one part of the speech to the next part. But there, of course, colleagues who've listened to the original may confirm that that was precisely what happened in the original speech, that there was the same sort of logical jump, and therefore the candidate's performance would have to take that into account. So there we are. As I say, I think with the wisdom of hindsight again, it's easy to ask why we didn't always organise testing like that, because it does make it so much easier. You've got 3, 4, 5 people doing the assessing, and you can break up their job into all the different component parts. someone to check for plausibility, someone to check for accuracy, someone to say how it sounds in the A language or the B language or whatever. And, well, as I keep saying, I've been in this profession for many, many years, and so many things have changed beyond recognition. I'm not convinced that all of them have been improvements. In fact, if you pushed me, I would tend to say the opposite. But here, at least, is one area where I think real progress has been made, and that we can actually make a far better job of assessing interpreting now than the people who assessed me 30, 40 years ago, which is perhaps just as well, because otherwise I might not have passed my test. Thank you.